The Cursed Cemetery of Chestnut Hill, an Appalachian horror story. There are places in this world that time forgets. Hollows tucked so deep into the mountains that sunlight barely touches the ground before noon, where the fog rolls in thick and cold, even in the heart of summer, where the names on the gravestones repeat themselves over and over again, the same surnames, generation after generation, carved into crumbling limestone markers that lean and sink into the earth like old men too tired to stand. Chestnut Hill is one of those places, and the cemetery at its edge is something else entirely. The Cursed Cemetery of Chestnut Hill. Say those words to anyone who grew up within 50 miles of that hollow, and watch what happens to their face. Watch how their eyes go somewhere far away. Watch how their voice drops just a little lower when they answer you. Because everyone around those parts has heard the stories, and some of them have seen what the stories are really about. This is not a ghost story. There are no spirits drifting between the mossy headstones at midnight, no voices calling out from the darkness beyond the tree line. What happened in Chestnut Hill was far more real than any ghost, far more permanent, far more devastating. This is the story of the Pruett family, Harlan, Dottie, and their grown son Amos, 3 people who lived and died in that hollow, whose lives were shaped by choices made long before any of them drew their first breath, whose suffering was written into their very bodies before they ever opened their eyes to see the world. This is a story about what happens when a family turns entirely inward, when the outside world becomes the enemy, when love curdles into something that can never fully be called love at all. Before we go any further, take 30 seconds right now and check whether you are already subscribed to this channel. Right now, go look, because this channel tells the stories that other people are afraid to tell. The real ones, the ones buried in county records and forgotten newspaper clippings, and the long, uncomfortable silences of people who were there and wish they hadn't been. If you want to keep hearing stories like this one, subscribe now, you will not regret it. Now, let us go back to Chestnut Hill. The hollow sits in the southwestern corner of Harlan County, Kentucky, wedged between 2 ridges that rise so steeply they seem to lean toward each other overhead, as though the mountains themselves are conspiring to keep the place hidden. The creek that runs through the bottom of the hollow is called Pruett Creek, and it has been called that for as long as anyone can remember, because for as long as anyone can remember, the Pruetts have been the only family that lived there. The old-timers in the county seat used to say that the Pruetts were already in that hollow when their grandparents' were born, that they had always been there, that they always would be. The road into Chestnut Hill, and if you could call it a road, was little more than 2 tire tracks worn into the hillside, separated by a ridge of tall weeds that scraped the underside of any vehicle brave enough to attempt the drive. The county stopped maintaining it sometime in the 1940s, around the time the last of the other families who had once tried to settle in the hollow packed up and left. One by one, the other households had gone. The Bakers, the Collinses, the Warfields, all of them eventually pulled up their roots and moved somewhere, anywhere else. They gave different reasons when they left. The land was too steep for good farming. The road was impassable in winter. The school was too far for the children. But if you pressed them, if you sat with them long enough over a cup of coffee and earned a measure of their trust, the older ones would eventually tell you the real reason. They would tell you about the Pruetts. They would tell you about what they had seen. Harlan Pruett was born in 1922, the 3rd child of Eldon and Marvella Pruett, who were themselves first cousins. Harlan never knew his father well. Eldon died of a fever when Harlan was 4 years old, leaving Marvella alone with 3 children in a 2-room cabin that had been built by Harlan's great-grandfather sometime after the Civil War. The cabin sat on a small flat bench of land above the creek, shaded by a pair of enormous chestnut trees that had somehow survived the blight that wiped out most of the American chestnuts in those mountains in the early part of the century. Those 2 trees were the reason the hollow had its name. Marvella called them a blessing. She believed with the complete and unwavering certainty of a woman who had never been encouraged to question her own beliefs that those trees watched over her family, that they were a sign of God's particular favor toward the Pruetts. She taught her children this. She taught them many things. What Marvella taught her children above all else was that the outside world could not be trusted. She had learned this from her own mother, who had learned it from hers. The world beyond the ridge was full of people who would look at a Pruett family and see something to pity, something to mock, something to take advantage of. Better to stay close, better to keep to their own, better to rely on family for everything, for company, for comfort, for everything that a person needs from another human being. The world ends at the ridgeline. That was how Marvella said it. The world ends at the ridgeline, and everything beyond it is not our concern. Harlan grew up hearing this so often that it became as natural to him as breathing. He was a quiet boy, broad-shouldered and dark-eyed, with hands that seemed too large for his body, even when he was young. His older sister, Beryl, was the one who managed the household after their mother's health began to fail. His younger brother, Dale, was small and prone to illness, and spent most of his childhood bundled near the wood stove, while Beryl and Harlan did the work of keeping the family alive. They farmed the narrow strips of bottomland along the creek. They kept chickens. They hunted the ridges for squirrel and deer. They traded occasionally at a small store 4 miles down the county road. A store run by a man named Combs, who kept his opinions about the Pruetts carefully to himself, because he had learned over the years that speaking them aloud was not worth the trouble it caused. Harlan was 19 years old when he married Dottie. Her full name was Dorothy Ray Pruett. She was his first cousin once removed, the daughter of his father's younger brother, a man named Clem who had moved to the far side of the ridge before Harlan was born and had a family of his own over there. Harlan had met Dottie only 3 or 4 times before the wedding, at a cousin's funeral, at a family gathering one summer, at church on Christmas morning the year she was 16. She was 20 when they married, a thin, pale young woman with light brown hair and a habit of folding her hands in her lap whenever she was nervous, which was often. She had grown up with the same lessons Harlan had learned. The world ends at the ridgeline. Trust your own blood. Stay close to family. And so when the arrangement was proposed by the older members of the Pruett family, she did not resist it. This was simply how things were done. This was simply how they had always been done. What nobody talked about, at least not in terms that acknowledged the reality of what they were describing, was the pattern that had been building in the Pruett bloodline for generations. Marvella's parents had been cousins. Eldon and Marvella had been cousins. Clem, Dottie's father, had also married within the family. And before that, the same pattern stretching back through the decades, back through the names carved on the limestone markers in the small cemetery at the edge of the hollow. Back to a time when the hollow was even more isolated than it was in Harlan and Dottie's day, when the ridgelines were even more impenetrable, when the idea of marrying outside the family was not merely unusual, but genuinely unthinkable. Generation after generation, the same bloodline folding back upon itself. Generation after generation, the same genetic material recombining in ways that nature does not intend. The consequences were written in the bodies of the Pruett children. Not in every generation, not in every child. The cruelty of genetics is that it does not announce itself consistently or predictably, but often enough and visibly enough that anyone outside the family who ever caught a glimpse of a Pruett child would carry the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Dale, Harlan's younger brother, had been one of the lucky ones, or at least the less unlucky ones. He was small and sickly, but otherwise unremarkable in appearance. Beryl had a slight asymmetry to her face, a drooping of the left eye that she kept covered as much as possible with her hair. But there had been others. Cousins born to other branches of the family, whose deformities were more severe. Children who lived only weeks or months, children who survived into adulthood, but whose appearance was a testament to the cost of generations of consanguinity. Amos was born to Harlan and Dottie in 1944, in the same cabin where Harlan had been born, delivered by Beryl's hands because there was no other help to be had. The birth was difficult. Dottie was in labor for 2 days, and by the time Amos arrived, both mother and child were exhausted in a way that took weeks to recover from. But he survived. He was alive. And Harlan, sitting by the fire with his son wrapped in a flannel blanket in his arms, felt something that he could not have named, but that was real and overwhelming, a ferocious, protective love. The love of a man who had been taught that family was everything. That blood was the only thing in the world that truly mattered. It was clear within the first weeks of Amos's life that something was different about him. The shape of his face was not quite right. There was an asymmetry to it, that went beyond what could be attributed to the normal variation of human features, a heaviness to the brow and a narrowing of the jaw that gave him a look of permanent tension even when he was sleeping. His eyes were set very close together, so close that the bridge of his nose seemed almost non-existent, the eyes appearing to crowd toward the center of his face in a way that was disconcerting to anyone who looked at him directly. One hand had only 3 fully formed fingers. The ring finger and the small finger of his right hand were fused together into a single broader digit, smooth and curved at the tip, without the crease of a knuckle to separate them. His hearing, it became apparent as he grew, was impaired in his left ear. His speech, when it came, was slow and difficult, not from lack of intelligence exactly, but from some combination of his hearing loss and the physical structure of his mouth and throat, which made certain sounds nearly impossible for him to produce clearly. Harlan looked at his son and felt that same ferocious love. He did not see what others would have seen. He saw his boy, his blood. Dottie looked at her son and felt that love, and underneath it, buried very deep where she never allowed herself to examine it directly, something else, a sorrow, a knowledge. She had seen the photographs of other Pruett children. She had heard the stories. She had made a private calculation years before Amos was born that told her what the odds were. And when she held her son and traced the fused fingers of his right hand and felt the strange architecture of his face beneath her palm, she understood what those odds had produced. She held him closer. She said nothing. She would say nothing for the rest of her life. Check right now, are you subscribed to this channel? Because the stories here go places most channels are afraid to go. The real history, the uncomfortable truth. Subscribe now so you never miss a story like this one. The Hollow existed in a kind of suspended time throughout Amos's childhood and adolescence. The wider world was changing. The war came and went. The country rebuilt itself. The cities grew and modernized and moved toward a future that was bright and loud and full of possibility. But in Chestnut Hill, almost nothing changed. Harlan still farmed the same strips of bottomland his grandfather had farmed. Dottie still cooked on the same wood stove that had been there when Marvella was alive. The cabin had a few new additions. A second room built on the back for Amos, a small smokehouse behind the main structure. But the essential shape of life in the Hollow was the same in 1955 as it had been in 1925. The ridgeline was still the boundary. The outside world was still the enemy. The family was still everything. Amos grew into a young man who was large and strong despite his other difficulties. The work of the Hollow, the farming, the hauling of water, the carrying of firewood, the constant labor of maintaining the structures against the damp and cold, had built him into someone physically powerful in a way that surprised people who met him for the first time, because his face prepared them for fragility, and they found instead a man whose arms could lift what others could not, whose hands, even the right one with its fused fingers, could grip and hold and work with a determination that more than compensated for their unusual structure. He was not fragile, he was not broken, he was simply Amos, he was simply himself. But Amos was also profoundly lonely in a way that he had no language to describe and that his parents had no framework to address. His world was the size of the Hollow. It had always been the size of the Hollow. He had never attended a school. Dottie had done her best to teach him to read and do figures, with limited success given the combination of his hearing impairment and the difficulty she had in understanding exactly what his needs were. He had never had a friend his own age. He had never had a conversation with anyone outside his immediate family. His social universe was 2 people, his father and his mother. That was all. That was the entire extent of his human contact. And as he moved through his 20s and into his 30s, as the particular kind of loneliness that comes from never being truly known by another person accumulated in him like water behind a dam, something in Amos began to change in ways that were quiet at first and then increasingly impossible to ignore. He began to spend more time in the cemetery. The Pruett family cemetery was at the far edge of the Hollow, where the bench of flat land ended and the hillside rose steeply toward the eastern ridge. It was a small plot, no more than 30 or 40 graves, enclosed by a rusting iron fence that Harlan's grandfather had installed sometime around the turn of the century. The markers were a mixture of rough-cut limestone slabs and carved headstones. the older ones so worn by weather that the names on them were barely legible. Pruett, Pruett, Pruett. The same name over and over, with different first names and different dates, but the same essential story. Lives lived and ended in this hollow, in this particular square of Kentucky earth, generation after generation, world without end. Amos went to the cemetery the way other people might go to church. He went when the weather was good and when it was bad. He went in the early morning and in the late afternoon, and sometimes in the middle of the night, when the hollow was so dark and quiet that the only sounds were the creak and the wind in the high branches. He could not read most of the markers. His reading was limited and the old inscriptions defeated him entirely, but he ran his hands over them, feeling the shapes of the carved letters, tracing the raised stone edges of names he knew were his family's names, even if he could not fully decode them. He sat for hours on the low stone wall at the back of the plot, looking at the graves, looking at the hillside above them, looking at the sky that was visible in the gap between the ridges. What was he thinking during those hours? No one ever knew, no one ever asked. His parents knew he went to the cemetery and they did not stop him. In Harlan's mind, it was simply another expression of what he had always taught his son. That family was everything. That blood was the only currency that mattered. That the Pruetts of the past and the Pruetts of the present, and whatever Pruetts there might be in the future, were all part of the same essential thing. That the cemetery was not a place of endings, but a place of continuity. Amos understood this in some way that did not require language. He felt it. He sat with it for hours in the quiet of the hollow, surrounded by the names of people who shared his blood, and felt something that was the closest thing to peace that his life offered him. Harlan's health began to fail when he was in his early 60s. It was his heart primarily, a weakness that the county doctor attributed to decades of hard physical labor in poor conditions, though there were other factors at work that the doctor either did not know about or chose not to name directly. The doctor was a young man from Lexington who had taken the county position 2 years earlier, full of education and good intentions, and the first time he visited the Pruett cabin, Harlan was too weak to make the drive to the county seat. He spent the drive back to town trying to process what he had seen. He wrote carefully in his notes. He described Harlan's symptoms accurately and thoroughly. He made no comment on the family's living situation, on the structure of the household, on anything that was not strictly within his medical purview. He was a careful young man. He prescribed medication for Harlan's heart. He recommended rest, reduced physical exertion, a change in diet. Harlan nodded at all of this and did almost none of it because the hollow required what it required, and the hollow did not care about a doctor's recommendations. Dottie did what she could. She took over more of the physical work, enlisting Amos to do the heaviest tasks, adjusting the meals she cooked to include more of what the doctor had suggested. She was in her early 60s herself by then, and the years of hard living in the hollow had taken their toll on her in ways that were visible. She was thin and slightly stooped, her hair completely white, her hands roughened and enlarged by decades of work. She moved through the cabin with the efficient economy of someone who had never had the luxury of wasted movement, and she cared for Harlan with the same matter-of-fact competence with which she approached every task. She did not speak about her feelings. She had never spoken about her feelings, but the shape of her days, the way she arranged the cabin around his comfort, the way she managed his medications, the way she sat near him in the evenings and kept him company in silence, all of it said what she could not put into words. The nights in the hollow in those years were very quiet. After supper, when the wood stove had been banked and the lamp turned down, the three of them would sit in the main room of the cabin, Harlan in the old armchair near the stove, Dottie in her straight-backed chair by the window, Amos on the floor near the door, his back against the wall, his large hands resting in his lap, and the silence between them was complete and full of everything that had never been said. Outside, the creek ran over its stones. The wind moved through the chestnut trees. The hollow settled into darkness, and the three of them sat together in the way that families sit when they have been together so long that the need for conversation has passed, when presence itself is the language, when simply being in the same room with the same people you have always been with is enough. Except that it was not enough. It had never been enough. and all three of them knew it, in the private spaces of their own minds, where they would never let each other in. Harlan knew that his son had no future outside these walls. He knew that the choices made by his family, by himself, by his parents, by all the generations before him, had produced a man who was not equipped to survive in the world beyond the ridgeline, and that the world beyond the ridgeline would not receive Amos with anything like kindness if he ever tried. He knew all of this, and he filed it in the same place where he filed everything that was too painful to look at directly. He had learned this from his mother. Some things, Marvella used to say, are better left in the dark where they can't hurt you. Some things you just don't look at. Dottie knew something different. Dottie knew the full weight of what had been done. Not done to her. She was not a woman who thought of herself as a victim, had never been raised to use that language or that framework, but done to Amos. Done by the choices that she and Harlan had made, and that their parents had made, and their parents before them. She could trace the line of it with perfect clarity in the long, dark nights when she could not sleep and lay in the narrow bed, listening to Harlan's labored breathing and thinking about her son in the room at the back of the cabin. She could see how the pattern had worked. She understood genetics no better than anyone in her community. She had no formal education to speak of, had never read a science textbook, had no vocabulary for recessive traits or chromosomal expression. But she understood in her bones what had happened. She had seen too many Pruett children not to understand, and the understanding was a weight she carried every day of her life, from the morning she first saw Amos's face clearly until the last morning of her own life, without ever setting it down, without ever sharing it with another living soul. Now pause here for just a moment. If this story is affecting you, if you're feeling the weight of what these three people carried, drop a comment right now. Tell us, what do you think about the choices that were made in Chestnut Hill? The comments are open. Speak your mind. Amos carried something different still. He carried what it was to be Amos, to move through the world in a body and a face that were arranged in ways that made people flinch, to have learned very early that the rare encounters he had with strangers ended the same way, with eyes that went wide and then deliberately away, with voices that changed register, with bodies that took a small unconscious step backward. He had learned to manage this. He had developed a set of adaptations, keeping his face down, standing at angles, turning his right hand so that the fused fingers were less visible, speaking as little as possible in situations where speaking was difficult for him. He had learned to exist in the social world as something minimally visible, something that caused minimal disruption, something that could be overlooked if he managed himself correctly. But he was not stupid. That needs to be said clearly and without qualification. Amos Pruett was not an unintelligent man. His hearing impairment and his speech difficulties and his limited education had created the impression among the few outsiders who ever encountered him that he was simple, that the differences in his body extended to his mind in a way that reduced him to something less than fully aware. This impression was wrong. Amos understood his situation with a clarity that would have been uncomfortable to acknowledge, for both him and for his parents, if it had ever been spoken aloud. He understood what had made him. He understood why the world looked at him the way it did. He understood that the life he was living, in this hollow, in this cabin with these two aging people, was the only life he would ever have. And he had made a kind of peace with this that was not really peace at all, but was the closest thing available to him. What he could not make peace with was the future. Not his own future exactly. He had no specific ambitions, no plans, nothing he was waiting for. What he could not stop thinking about, in the long quiet nights and the long quiet days and the long hours in the cemetery, was what came after. What happened when Harlan was gone? What happened when Dottie was gone? What happened when Amos was alone in the hollow with nobody left? Who knew his name, who had always known his name, who called him by it in the ordinary way that people call each other by name when they have known each other forever. He did not know what happened then. He could not imagine it. And the inability to imagine it was its own kind of terror. Harlan died in the spring of 1981. He died in his chair by the wood stove in the early afternoon, with the pale April sunlight coming through the cabin window and the sound of the creak audible through the thin walls. Dottie was in the kitchen when it happened, and Amos was outside splitting wood. And when Dottie came into the main room to call Harlan for his afternoon medication, She found him still and quiet in the chair, his hands folded in his lap, his face relaxed in a way it had not been in years. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went to the door and called Amos's name, her voice carrying through the hollow in a way that made him look up from the woodpile, and then set down the axe and walked toward the cabin with his peculiar loping gait, because something in her voice told him what he needed to know before he got there. They buried Harlan in the family cemetery, as every Pruett had been buried. Amos dug the grave himself, working with a methodical patience that took most of a day, because the ground was still hard from the winter and the work was slow. There was no service, no ceremony beyond what Dottie spoke quietly over the grave in her own words. She had never been comfortable with formal prayer, with the elaborate ritual of Sunday services, and the hollow was too far from town for a minister to come out on short notice. She said what she said. Amos listened, holding his hat in his hands, his eyes on his father's grave, his face unreadable. Then they walked back to the cabin together, and Dottie made supper, and the two of them ate in silence at the small kitchen table. After that, things changed in the hollow in ways that were hard to define. The absence of Harlan was a presence in itself, a particular shape of silence in the chair by the stove, a particular absence of the sound of his voice in the evenings, a particular change in the atmosphere of the cabin that both Dottie and Amos felt, and neither of them acknowledged. They continued to do what needed to be done. The farm, reduced now to what the two of them could manage, continued to produce enough for survival. The chickens continued to be tended. The woodpile continued to be restocked. The routines of the hollow continued because the hollow demanded them, and they had no other routines to substitute. But Dottie was slowing down. It was visible in the way she moved through the cabin, the increasing care with which she negotiated the step between the kitchen and the main room. The longer pauses before she rose from her chair, the way she sometimes stood in the middle of a task and seemed for a moment to forget what she had been doing. She was in her early 60s, but she moved like someone older, her body depleted by decades of hard living in a way that had accelerated after Harlan's death, as though the effort of caring for him had been what kept her moving. And now that the purpose was gone, the body was reassessing its position. Amos watched his mother with the same attentiveness with which he watched everything that mattered to him, quietly, from a slight distance, saying nothing but missing nothing. He took over more of the work without being asked. He managed the garden almost entirely on his own now. He made the occasional trip to the store down the road, a journey that required him to walk 4 miles each way, and that brought him into contact with whatever strangers happened to be at the store when he arrived. Encounters he navigated with his established strategies of minimal visibility, of keeping his face down and his right hand in his pocket, and his business as brief as possible. He brought back flour and salt and the occasional tin of something, and he brought back once a bottle of the liniment that Dottie used for the pain in her joints, because he had seen it in the cabinet and noticed it was almost gone, and understood what it meant that it was almost gone. She was not going to last much longer. He knew this in the way that people know things they cannot bear to know, sideways, obliquely, without looking at it directly. He had known it for a while, and he spent more and more time in the cemetery, sitting on the stone wall at the back of the plot, not looking at his father's grave particularly, just sitting in the presence of all of them, all the Pruetts, all the generations, the accumulated weight of all the blood that had made him, feeling something that he could not name. What do you feel when you think about what these lives looked like? What word comes to mind for you right now? Drop it in the comments. Dottie died in the fall of 1983. She had been failing steadily through the summer, and by September she was spending most of each day in her chair or in bed, and Amos was doing everything: cooking, cleaning, hauling water, keeping the fire, sitting with her in the evenings the way she had once sat with Harlan. He was not skilled in the kitchen, but he was methodical, and he reproduced the meals she had always made with enough accuracy that she could eat them, and he kept the cabin clean with the same thoroughness he brought to every physical task. He sat with her every evening in the main room, and sometimes she talked and he listened, nodding, picking up the thread of what she said, even when her voice was too low or her words too unclear for him to fully catch all of them. He was good at listening. He had always been good at listening. She talked about Harlan. She talked about the early years in the hollow, the hard years, the years when they were young, and the future seemed like a real thing, rather than a series of days to be endured. She talked about her own mother, who had taught her to cook and to sew and to keep house, and had also taught her everything that Marvella had taught Harlan. The world ends at the ridgeline. Trust your own blood. Stay close to family. She talked about the chestnut trees and about the creek in summer, when it ran low and clear, and you could see the stones on the bottom. She talked about small things, ordinary things, the texture and fabric of a life lived in one place for 60 years. She did not talk about the things she had never talked about. Some of them she had carried too long to put down now. Once, near the end, she reached out and took Amos's right hand in both of hers and held the fused fingers gently and did not say anything for a long time. Amos sat very still. He did not look at her. He looked at the wall, at the window, at the pale October light that came through the glass and fell across the floor of the cabin. He did not move his hand. He let her hold it. He felt the weight of everything she was not saying, and he understood it in the way he understood everything, sideways, obliquely, in the part of himself that did not require language. He understood. He had always understood. She died quietly in her sleep in November, when the first hard freeze had come to the hollow, and the creek had iced at its edges, and the bare branches of the chestnut trees were black against the pale sky. Amos found her in the morning when he came to bring her the tea he had been making for her every morning for the last 6 months. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. Then he set the tea down on the table beside her bed. He pulled the quilt up around her shoulders, as though she might be cold. He stood there for a long time. Then he went outside and began to dig. He buried her next to Harlan in the family cemetery, and he said nothing over the grave. He did not have words for what needed to be said, and the words he did have did not seem adequate to the size of what had happened. He stood at the grave for a long time when the work was done, his hat in his hands, looking at the 2 mounds of fresh earth side by side, and then he looked at the rows of headstones behind them, all the names, all the generations, and then he looked up at the ridge above the cemetery, at the sky above the ridge, at the particular pale blue of a November sky in the Kentucky mountains. Then he walked back to the cabin and he built up the fire, and he sat in his father's old chair by the wood stove and he waited. The winter was long, and he got through it. The spring came, and he planted what he knew how to plant. The summer passed, another winter, another spring. The years began to accumulate with a sameness that had a quality less like time passing and more like time refusing to move. Each day essentially identical to the last, the same routines, the same hollow, the same creek and trees and ridges, the same face in the small wavy mirror that hung by the cabin door. He was in his 40s by now. He had been alone for years. He had spoken to no one in any meaningful sense since his mother's death, except the brief transactional exchanges at the store down the road, which he visited less and less frequently as the years went on. He was not unhappy in any way he could identify. Unhappiness requires a contrast, requires the knowledge of a different state that the current state is lacking, and Amos had no such knowledge. He had always been alone in the essential sense, even when Harlan and Dottie were alive. He had always lived inside himself. He was simply continuing to do what he had always done. The hollow was his world. The cemetery was his companionship, in whatever way a row of headstones can provide companionship. Through the continuity they represent, through the sense that here in this ground, something of the people you came from persists. He went to the cemetery more often as he grew older. He began, gradually, to do something he had never done before. He began to talk there, not to any specific grave, not with any formal intention of prayer or address, just talking quietly, in the way he had never been able to talk to anyone while they were alive, his voice rough from disuse and difficult to understand even to his own ears, saying whatever came to him. Observations about the weather, about the state of the garden, about what he had seen that morning on the hillside. He talked to the headstones the way he had never been able to talk to the people they marked, and there was something in this, some release, some version of what other people found in conversation that kept him coming back. The county, in the meantime, had not forgotten the Pruetts exactly. The county remembered the Pruetts in the way that places remember things that they would prefer not to. Incompletely, with significant gaps, shaped more by the stories people told each other than by any accurate record of what had actually happened. The younger generations knew the Pruetts mainly as a legend, the strange family in the hollow, the ones who kept to themselves, the ones who didn't come to town, the ones whose family cemetery was the whole story of everything that was wrong with that place. Children in the county dared each other to walk up the road into Chestnut Hill. Most of them got as far as the first bend and turned back. A few made it to the flat where the cabin was visible. None of them ever approached the cabin itself. The young county doctor who had treated Harlan had moved on years ago. His replacement and his replacement's replacement had little occasion to think about the hollow unless someone raised it specifically, which happened rarely. The county had its own more pressing concerns: the decline of the coal industry, the loss of jobs, the exodus of young people to the cities, all the familiar sorrows of a rural Appalachian county in the second half of the 20th century. Chestnut Hill and the man living alone in it existed at the very edge of the county's awareness, noticed only occasionally, and then mostly with a discomfort that no one quite wanted to examine. There was a woman named Shirley Combs, the granddaughter of the store owner, who had kept his opinions about the Pruetts carefully to himself, who thought about Amos Pruett more than most. She had grown up hearing about the family from her grandfather, who had told his stories with a care and a lack of cruelty that was unusual in those parts, who had spoken about the Pruetts as people rather than as a legend, who had said once, in a way that Shirley had never forgotten, that every person in that hollow was somebody's child, and nobody asked to be born into whatever situation they were born into. And it was worth remembering that before you talked about people the way people in this county talk about the Pruetts. She was in her 50s when Amos began appearing at the store again more regularly, after a gap of several years during which he had not come at all. She was behind the counter when he walked in the first time after the gap, and she did what she had taught herself to do, what her grandfather had modeled for her, which was to look at him directly and greet him by name, and treat the transaction with the same ordinary courtesy she extended to every customer. He stopped walking when she said his name. He stood in the doorway of the store for a moment, as though the sound of his own name spoken by another person had caught him completely off guard. Then he came in. He made his purchase. He said very little, as he always had, but he looked at her directly as he was leaving, which he had never done before, and nodded once with a gravity that she felt long after he had gone. After that, he came every few weeks. Shirley never pushed the conversation further than he took it. She answered his questions, completed his transactions, made the occasional observation about the weather. But she made a point of being there when he came in, made a point of having a moment of unhurried attention to give him, and she noticed over the months and then years that those moments seemed to be something he held on to, that he arrived at the store with a slightly different quality of attention in the weeks after their exchanges than in the weeks before. She noticed this without being entirely certain what to do with it. She was a practical woman, not a romantic one, and she did not tell herself a story about what these visits meant. She simply continued to be there. She continued to say his name. If you have ever been that person for someone, the one who simply said the name, who simply stayed, leave a comment below and tell us. If you know what it means to be seen when the world has mostly looked away, leave a comment. This is the kind of story that deserves to be heard. Amos was in his early 60s when he first began to feel what he recognized from watching his father, as his heart beginning to fail him. The same heaviness in the chest, the same shortness of breath on climbs that had never troubled him before, the same fatigue that descended in the afternoons without warning. He did not go to see a doctor. The idea did not occur to him as a natural response to what he was feeling. In the world he had grown up in, bodies failed and people endured it, or they did not endure it. You kept working as long as you could work. You kept living as long as you could live. He kept working. He kept living. He made adjustments. He rested more. He moved more slowly. He stopped taking on the heaviest of the physical tasks that the hollow demanded. The garden got smaller. The woodpile got lower. He made more frequent trips to the store, not because he needed more supplies, but because he realized slowly the brief exchanges with Shirley Combs had become something he depended on in a way he had not anticipated and could not have predicted. They were not friendship exactly. They were not the kind of thing he had grown up understanding as friendship, but they were the closest thing he had. And as his body continued its slow withdrawal from the physical demands of his life, those moments of being seen became something he held on to harder. The last winter was a hard one. The temperatures dropped early and stayed low, and the roads into the hollow became impassable in January, and Amos stayed in the cabin through the coldest weeks with the wood stove going, and the supplies he had laid in, and the knowledge, present in him but unacknowledged in the way of all the most important things, that this was the last hard winter he was going to get through. He did get through it. The spring came tentative and cold at first, and then warmer, and then green in the way that spring in those mountains is green, sudden and overwhelming, the trees going from bare to full seemingly overnight, the creek running high and noisy with snowmelt, the hollow filling up with birdsong. He spent the spring in the cemetery. He spent it there more than anywhere else, sitting on the stone wall and talking to the headstones in his rough, difficult voice, saying things that nobody heard, saying things that were long overdue. He talked to Harlan, he talked to Dottie, he talked to all of them, all the names, all the generations, all the people whose blood ran in him and had produced him and had given him this life in this hollow in these mountains. He was not angry. That is important to say. He had never had the framework for anger, the language of grievance, the ability to hold the choices of his parents and their parents up to the light and name what they had cost. He did not have those words. He had only what he had: his life, his body, this ground, these graves, this sky. He died in the cemetery in the early summer. Shirley Combs, when he had not appeared at the store for 3 weeks, drove up the road into the hollow. The first person from outside to attempt it in years, the tires of her truck fighting the overgrown track the whole way. She found the cabin empty but not abandoned, the wood stove cold, the dishes stacked neatly by the basin, the old armchair still positioned by the stove as though waiting for someone to return to it. She walked to the cemetery and found him there, sitting against the stone wall at the back of the plot, his hat on his knee, his face turned toward the row of headstones, his hands folded in his lap. He was gone. He had been gone for some time. He looked peaceful. He looked, for the first time in the photographs she had seen and the years she had known him, as though the permanent tension had finally left his face. She sat with him for a while before she did anything else. She sat with him in the cemetery of Chestnut Hill, among all the headstones with all the Pruett names, and she did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The creek ran in the hollow below. The chestnut trees, the 2 enormous survivors, the ones Marvella had called a blessing, moved in the light summer wind. The sky above the ridge was the particular blue of a Kentucky summer morning, high and clear and without limit. She had him buried there in the family plot, next to Harlan and Dottie. It seemed right, it was the only place he had ever belonged. The cemetery at Chestnut Hill is still there. If you know where to look, if you can find the overgrown track that was once a road, if you push through the vegetation that has reclaimed most of the flat bench of land above the creek, you can find the iron fence and the limestone markers and the headstones that lean at their various angles toward the earth. The chestnut trees are still there too, which is the real miracle. 2 American chestnuts that somehow survived everything the blight threw at them, still standing, still leafing out each spring, still dropping their nuts in the fall, still watching over whatever remains of the Pruetts. If you go there, and most people who hear this story think about going and then think better of it, the thing you notice first is the names. How many times the same name appears, how the dates overlap and repeat, generation after generation, the same bloodline looping back through itself. You notice the repetition. You stand in front of the stones and you feel the weight of it, the accumulated gravity of all those generations of choices, and you understand something that is very hard to put into words but very easy to feel. Every family has its stories, every family has its silences, every family has the things it never talks about, the choices made by those who came before, the costs that compound over time and are paid eventually by people who had no voice in making them. What happened to the Pruetts was an extreme version of something that is not, at its root, unfamiliar. The desire to stay close to what is known, the fear of a world that does not seem welcoming, the belief that family is the only safe harbor in an ocean of uncertainty. These are human things. These are understandable things. The tragedy of Chestnut Hill is not that the Pruetts were monsters. The tragedy is that they were not. They were people who loved each other, people who tried to protect each other, people who built their world as small and safe as they could make it, and who did not understand, could not understand, had no one to teach them what the smallness was costing them, what it would cost Amos, what it had already cost the children who did not survive, whose names are on some of the oldest markers in that cemetery, whose dates show a span of days or weeks between birth and death. They were people doing the only thing they knew how to do, in the only world they had ever been given. And the world they had given Amos was the hollow, and the hollow was the cemetery, and the cemetery was the end. If you are still here, if you watched this all the way through, if you sat with Amos through the winters and the springs and the long quiet years, then you felt something. That something is worth paying attention to. Not because there is an easy lesson here, not because there is a clean moral that resolves everything neatly, but because the feeling itself is information. The feeling is telling you something about what human beings need and what happens when those needs are not met, and what we owe each other even when, especially when, the owing is difficult. The cursed cemetery of Chestnut Hill. The curse was never supernatural. The curse was choices, generations of them, and the people who paid the price were the ones who had no choice at all. If you watched this all the way to the end, and I know some of you did because you felt every word of it, leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end." I want to know who you are. I want to know who stayed with Amos until the very last frame. Leave that comment. It matters. And if this story stayed with you, if you're going to be thinking about Chestnut Hill for the next few days, turning it over in your mind the way these kinds of stories stay with you, hit the like button before you close this video. Every like tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be heard. Every share puts this story in front of someone else who needs to hear it. Share it with someone tonight. Share it with someone who you think would feel what you just felt. Because stories like this one don't get told enough, and the people thereabout deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel if you aren't already, because there are more stories like this one. There are more hollows and more names and more headstones leaning into the earth, and more silences that lasted too long, and more things that need to be said out loud so that the people who lived them are not simply forgotten. This channel is where those stories live. Subscribe, stay, and we will keep going together. The cursed cemetery of Chestnut Hill, remember the name, remember the family, remember Amos, sitting on the stone wall in the early summer light, his hat on his knee, his face turned toward the graves, finally at peace, in the only place he had ever truly been home.